The September wind rattled the windows like a prisoner shaking the bars of his cell. It was 1884, 12 miles south of Dodge City, Kansas, and this little ranch house was now my home, and my bridal chamber. I pulled a thin quilt around my shoulders, my bare feet dangling just above the rough wood floor. The lamp on the nightstand threw dancing, monstrous shadows across the walls. Outside, the prairie was a black sea under a sliver of moon, and the coyotes had started their nightly song, a lonely, hungry sound. It made me shiver, but I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or the nerves. I was married now. A bride. The door creaked open. Preston Pittman, my husband, stepped inside. He was tall and lean, with shoulders made broad by years of fighting this land for a living. His dark hair was still damp. He'd changed out of the suit he wore at the courthouse that morning. The whole ceremony had taken less time than it takes to saddle a horse. My heart hammered against my ribs. I'd been warned about wedding nights. My friend back in St. Louis said men drank whiskey, that it made them rough. I'd steeled myself for it. I expected him to come to the bed with liquor on his breath and a fire in his eyes. But that's not what he did. He walked to the stone fireplace, silent as a shadow, and began spreading a wool blanket across the floorboards. My throat went dry. "What are you doing?" I asked. My voice was a whisper, easily swallowed by the big, empty room. He didn't look at me. He just kept smoothing the edges of the blanket. "Making my bed," he said. "You take the proper one." The words hit me like a slap. Heat flooded my cheeks, a hot, nasty mix of confusion and shame. This wasn't right. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. "But we are married now," I said, the words feeling foolish on my tongue. "Yes, we are." His voice was flat, empty. "And as your husband, it is my duty to provide you with shelter and safety. The bed is yours." He settled onto the blanket with his back to me, using his rolled-up jacket as a pillow. The fire crackled. The wind howled. And I sat there, staring at the broad shape of his back, at the way the cheap cotton of his shirt stretched across his shoulders. Our whole courtship, arranged by mail and lawyers, had been like this, polite but cold, distant. I had assumed it was because our marriage was a business deal. My father had died deep in debt, and Preston had agreed to pay it all off, in exchange for a wife. It was a common enough arrangement out here where women were scarce and men needed a partner to help build a life out of dust and sky. I thought once the papers were signed, once the vows were said, things would change. I was wrong. Preston. I tried again, my voice trembling. Have I done something wrong? He was quiet for so long I thought he hadn't heard me. Then a single word, spoken so softly it was almost stolen by the wind. "No." "Then why don't you—" I couldn't finish. I couldn't bring myself to ask the question that was burning a hole in my chest. "Why don't you want me? Why won't you touch your wife?" He didn't answer. His breathing grew deep and even. He was either asleep or pretending to be. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that he would offer no other explanation. I lay back on the thin mattress, pulling the quilt up to my chin. The shadows on the ceiling danced and writhed as the fire died down to embers. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, made me hope he'd changed his mind, that he would get up and come to me. He never moved. Sometime before dawn, exhaustion finally took me. But when I woke, the sun was just a pale line on the horizon, and the space on the floor where he had slept was empty. He was already gone. The days that followed fell into a pattern as rigid as a jail sentence. He'd rise before dawn. I'd make breakfast. We'd eat in a silence so thick you could cut it with a knife. He'd tell me what chores needed doing, his eyes never quite meeting mine. "The chickens need tending," he'd say, or, "The garden could use weeding." Then he'd be gone, out on the vast, empty prairie, checking fence lines or tending to his cattle. He would return for the noon meal, eat quickly, and leave again. He was a ghost in his own home, a stranger who shared my name. The house itself was small, but sturdy. 2 rooms downstairs, a kitchen, and the main room where he slept on the floor, and a loft above where I slept in the bed. Alone. He had built most of the furniture himself, solid and plain, like the man himself. One afternoon, a week into our strange marriage, I couldn't take the silence anymore. He came in for lunch, his hat in his hand, and I stood in his way before he could escape to the barn. "Preston," I said, my voice stronger than I expected, "will you tell me why you married me, if you have no intention of being a true husband?" He froze. For a second, just a flicker, I saw something in his gray eyes. Pain. A deep, startling pain that was gone as quickly as it appeared. His face closed off, became a mask of stone. "You needed a home," he said, his voice flat. "I needed help with the ranch. It is a practical arrangement." "But surely you must want—" I started, my face burning. "I want nothing more than what we have agreed upon," he cut me off, his words sharp as broken glass. "Food, shelter, companionship when needed. Nothing more." He walked past me and out the door, his long strides carrying him away. I stood there in the doorway, the Kansas sun hot on my face, feeling smaller and more foolish than I ever had in my life. The words stung worse than any physical blow. Nothing more. That night, the pattern repeated. Supper in silence. Him on the floor, me in the bed. But this time, I didn't try to talk. The humiliation was a raw, open wound. As I lay in the dark, listening to the wind howl, I watched him. Even in sleep, his face was tight, his body tense. He looked like a man carrying a burden too heavy to bear. What had happened to this man? What sorrow had carved him out of stone and left him so empty? The coyotes called to each other across the dark prairie, their voices lonely and wild. I closed my eyes and wondered if I was doomed to live out my days with this silent, haunted man, a wife in name only, a stranger in my own home. When I woke the next morning, he was gone, and the space on the floor was cold. 2 weeks passed, then a month. The silence in that little house grew, became a living thing. It sat between us at the dinner table. It followed me through the empty rooms during the day. It lay beside me in the cold bed at night. Preston worked from sunup to sundown, as if he could exhaust the ghosts that haunted him. He was a good provider. The pantry was stocked, the roof didn't leak, and he bought me a new pair of boots when my old ones wore through. But he provided these things with the detached efficiency of a man paying a debt. There was no warmth, no kindness, no connection. The isolation was like a slow poison. Back in St. Louis, I'd had friends. We'd had sewing circles, church socials. Here, the nearest neighbor was 8 miles away. Dodge City, with its shops and people, might as well have been on another continent. Preston went to town for supplies once a week, but he never asked me to come along. "Mrs. Jenkins at the general store asked after you," he said one evening, his eyes on his plate of stew. My heart gave a little leap. "What did you tell her?" "That you were well." I waited. I prayed he would say more, that Mrs. Jenkins had invited me for tea, that there was a church social next Sunday, something, anything to break the crushing loneliness. But he said nothing else. He just kept eating his stew, and the silence rushed back in, colder than before. Autumn deepened. The Kansas wind grew teeth. The nights were the worst. I started bringing my mending downstairs just to be near the warmth of the fireplace. I'd sit in a rocking chair, sewing, while he worked on his ranch ledgers at the kitchen table. We shared the same small space, but we were 1,000 miles apart. Sometimes I'd look up and find him watching me. His gray eyes held an expression I couldn't read. It wasn't anger or dislike. It was something else, something deep and complicated. The moment our eyes met, he would look away, back to his columns of figures, as if I had caught him doing something wrong. One evening, I saw him rubbing his temples, his face tight with strain from staring at the ledger. "Would you like me to read aloud?" I offered, the words popping out before I could stop them. He looked up, genuinely surprised. "If it would not trouble you." My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the book of poetry I'd brought from St. Louis. I began to read, my voice shaky at first, then growing stronger. I read about love and loss, about the sea and the stars. And as I read, I felt a change in the room. His pen had gone still. His shoulders, usually so tense, seemed to relax. He kept his eyes on his ledger, but I knew he was listening to every word. When I finished, the silence that fell was different. It wasn't empty or cold. It was full, peaceful. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet. "Your voice is pleasant." It was the first compliment he had ever given me. A small, warm glow kindled in my chest. "I could read again tomorrow evening, if you would like." "Yes," he said, then cleared his throat. That would be acceptable. But the next evening, he didn't come in from the barn until long after dark. He walked straight to his blanket by the fire, avoiding the table, avoiding my eyes. He didn't want to be read to. He didn't want the connection. He wanted the distance. I put my book away, the foolish hope in my chest turning to ash. He had let me in, just a crack, and the closeness had spooked him. He was building the walls back up, higher and thicker than before. November came, and with it, the threat of real winter. Preston became even more withdrawn, working from dawn until well past dusk, preparing the ranch for the coming snows. He seemed driven by a desperate need to stay away from the house, away from me. I began to wonder if he regretted the marriage, if taking on my father's debts for a wife he so clearly didn't want was a bargain he now wished he could undo. The shame of it was a physical weight, pressing down on me day and night. Then one night, the first great storm of the winter hit. It came on fast, a shrieking monster of wind and snow. I lay in my loft bed, listening to the house groan and shudder. The temperature plummeted. I could see my own breath in the air. I piled every blanket I owned on top of me, but I couldn't stop shivering. Downstairs, I could hear Preston moving about, adding wood to the fire, checking the shutters. The storm raged for 2 days, trapping us together in that small house. By morning, 2 feet of snow were drifted against the door. Preston fought his way to the barn and back. "The animals are secure," he said, stamping snow from his boots. "But this storm may last for days. We must conserve food and fuel." It was the longest conversation we'd had in weeks, born of necessity, not desire. But as the blizzard howled outside, I was grateful for it. He made trip after trip to the barn, each one a battle against the elements. He'd come back crusted in ice, his face raw with the cold. I would have hot coffee waiting. I'd take his frozen coat and hang it by the fire. I'd heat water for him to thaw his hands. In these small acts of care, I felt something shift between us. Our fingers would brush as I handed him a mug. His eyes would widen, just for a second, at the contact. On the second day, his lips were tinged with blue when he came inside. "You should not go out again today," I said, my voice sharp with worry. "The animals need water. The trough has frozen solid." "Then wait. The wind is getting worse." He paused, his hand on the door latch. He looked at me, a strange expression on his face. "You worry for my safety?" The question surprised him as much as it did me. I felt my cheeks flush. "I would worry for anyone facing such conditions," I said carefully. Something flickered in his eyes. A crack in the stone facade. "I will wait another hour," he conceded. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. When the storm finally broke on the 4th day, leaving the world buried in a sea of white, a fragile connection had been forged between us. I dreaded the return to our old, cold silence. Preston, it seemed, dreaded the connection. He spent the entire day outside, digging paths to the barn, working with a frantic energy as if desperate to escape the memory of our shared confinement. That night, he sat with his ledgers, and I sat with my mending. But the silence was different. It was heavy with unspoken words, with the ghost of the intimacy we had shared. I found myself watching him, no longer trying to hide my curiosity. He was aware of my gaze, his shoulders were tense, his jaw tight. When he rose to bank the fire, I made a decision. "Preston," I said softly. He froze, his back to me. "During the storm," I started, searching for the right words. "When we worked together, I felt useful, like a true partner." He was still for so long I thought he would ignore me. Then he slowly turned to face me. "You were useful," he said, his voice low. "More than useful." The admission seemed to cost him something. He quickly spread his blanket on the floor, his movements agitated. "Good night, Emery." It was the first time he had used my name since our wedding day. The sound of it, in his voice, sent a shock of warmth through me. It was hopeful and terrifying all at once. "Good night, Preston." I lay awake for hours, replaying his words. More than useful. Had I imagined the warmth in his voice? Downstairs, I could hear him shifting restlessly on his blanket. He was awake, too. We were two people, lying awake in the same dark house, separated by only a few feet of floorboards, but a million miles of secrets. A longing so sharp, it was a physical pain pierced through me. Tomorrow, I promised myself. Tomorrow, I would demand answers. I would not live as a stranger to my own husband for one more day. But when morning came, he was gone. A note on the kitchen table said he was checking the south pasture for storm damage and wouldn't be back until evening. He was running again. The intimacy of the storm hadn't brought us closer. It had terrified him. And he was pushing me away, harder than ever before. December arrived, bringing a cold so bitter it felt like it could crack the very bones of the earth. The prairie was a glittering, dead thing, covered in snow and ice. Preston seemed to welcome the harshness. He threw himself into his work with a renewed fury, as if he could freeze out whatever demons were chasing him. From the kitchen window, I'd watch him break ice on the cattle pond, his movements sharp, almost violent. He attacked each chore like it was an enemy. It had been 3 months since our wedding day. 3 months of living with a ghost. I knew less about my husband than the strangers I'd sat next to on the train from St. Louis. The loneliness was becoming unbearable. It was a physical ache in my chest. I felt like I was disappearing, being slowly erased by the vast, silent emptiness of the prairie and the even bigger, more silent emptiness of my marriage. Then, on the evening of December 15th, another storm hit. This one came without warning. A monster that fell out of the sky. Preston had been out mending a fence. He burst through the door, a phantom made of snow and ice. His mustache and eyebrows were white, his coat frozen solid. "The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour," he said through chattering teeth. "This one will be worse than the last." I rushed to help him with his coat. The wind outside wasn't just howling, it was screaming. The whole house shuddered around us. "The cattle will need constant watching," he said, his knuckles white as he wrapped his hands around the coffee cup I gave him. "If they bunched together, they could suffocate in the drifts." "You can't go back out there," I said, looking at the window. The snow was a solid, swirling wall of white. "I have no choice." He stood, moving toward his coat with a grim resolve. "The livestock are my responsibility." And that's when I broke. The loneliness, the confusion, the hurt of the last 3 months erupted out of me. "And what of your responsibility to me?" The words hung in the air, electric. He stopped, his hand on his frozen coat. His back went rigid. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. My heart was hammering, but I couldn't take it back. "I asked about your responsibility to me. As your wife, you've given me food and shelter, but you treat me with less warmth than you show your cattle." He turned slowly. His gray eyes were dark, stormy. For the first time, I saw anger in them. "You knew the terms of our arrangement." "I knew it was a practical marriage. I didn't know I was signing up to be a ghost." My voice rose, shaking with emotion. "I am 20 years old, Preston. Am I to spend the rest of my life as a stranger in my own home?" The wind slammed against the house, rattling the windows, but we didn't look away. We were locked in a storm of our own. "You don't understand," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper above the wind. "Then help me understand. Tell me why you married me only to act as if my very presence pains you." "Because it does." The words hit me like a physical blow. They stole the air from my lungs. I finally had my answer. He found my presence painful. It was that simple. "I see," I whispered, turning away so he wouldn't see the tears that burned my eyes. "No." His hand clamped down on my arm. His grip was firm, but not rough. "You don't see. You don't understand what I mean." "I understand perfectly," I choked out. "You find me repugnant." "God help me," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It's the opposite." I turned back, stunned. "You are beautiful, Emery," he said, the words torn from him. "You are kind and good, and everything a man could ever want in a wife, and that is precisely why I cannot allow myself to touch you." The room spun. Nothing made sense. "I don't understand." He let go of my arm and walked to the window, staring out at the swirling white chaos. When he spoke again, his voice was flat, dead, as if he were talking about someone else. "6 years ago, I was married before." My breath hitched. "Her name was Sarah. She was 19, sweet and innocent, much like yourself. We had a proper church wedding. I thought I was the luckiest man in Kansas." "What happened to her?" I whispered. He turned from the window, and the look on his face will haunt me for the rest of my days. It was the face of a man who had been to hell and brought a piece of it back with him. "I happened to her," he said. The confession hung in the air, more terrifying than the raging storm outside. My husband, the silent, distant man I had lived with for 3 months, was telling me he was responsible for his first wife's death. The way he said it, the look in his eyes, it wasn't grief. It was guilt, the guilt of a killer. "We were happy," he went on, his voice a low, tortured rasp. "She conceived quickly. We were both so pleased. We were going to build a life, a family." He paused, his shoulders slumping as if under an invisible weight. "The labor, it was difficult. It went on for 2 days. By the end, she was so weak." He was painting a picture of a tragedy, but something felt wrong. The pieces didn't fit. "She died," he said, his voice breaking. "She died within minutes of the birth. The baby, our son, lived just long enough for me to hold him once." My mind was reeling, a horrible, tragic accident. But then why did he look like a man confessing to a crime? "As she was dying," he continued, his eyes boring into mine, "she looked at me with such love. She thanked me for making her a mother. And I had killed her, as surely as if I had put a gun to her head." "That's not true," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" He took a step closer, his face a mask of anguish. "It was my touch that put the child in her womb, my seed that grew into the thing that destroyed her from the inside out." He was practically shaking now, the careful control shattered. "Do you know what my last words to her were? As she lay there, dying in our bed, I promised her. I swore on her grave that I would never, ever put another woman at such risk, that I would never again let my selfishness destroy someone I claimed to love." The puzzle pieces clicked into place, forming a picture of a man so consumed by grief and guilt that he had sentenced himself to a lifetime of penance. "So, when I had to take another wife," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "I made a vow. You would have the protection of my name, the security of my home, but you would never have the danger of my touch. I stared at him, the cold, distant stranger suddenly transformed into a man drowning in a sea of his own making. He wasn't rejecting me. He was trying to protect me. "But I'm not Sarah," I whispered. "No," he said, his eyes full of a terrible, desperate sadness. "But you are just as precious, and I will not be responsible for destroying you, too." Tears streamed down my face. For him, for Sarah, for the terrible, lonely months I had endured, not understanding. I stepped closer, my hand rising as if of its own accord, and gently laid my palm against his cheek. He flinched, but didn't pull away. His whole body went rigid. "Preston," I said softly, "what if I told you that the risk doesn't frighten me?" "You're too young to understand," he choked out. "I'm the same age Sarah was. If she was old enough to make that choice, so am I. And look what happened to her." The words were a raw cry of pain. "Look what happens to women who live in loveless marriages," I countered, my thumb tracing the sharp line of his jaw. "They may live long, but do they ever truly live?" His eyes squeezed shut. A tremor ran through him. "I can't lose another wife," he whispered. "And I can't live as a stranger to my own husband," I whispered back. "Let me help you carry this. Don't punish both of us for a tragedy that wasn't your fault." He opened his eyes. They were filled with a desperate longing, and an even more desperate terror. "I don't know how to be a husband without being afraid." "Then we will learn together." I rose on my toes, my face inches from his. "Kiss me, Preston. Not because you have to, because you want to." For a long, agonizing moment, he just stared at me, his internal battle raging on his face. I thought he was going to pull away, to retreat back behind his wall of guilt. Then, his hands came up to frame my face. His touch was so gentle, so reverent, it made me want to weep. "I have wanted to kiss you since the day we were married," he breathed. "Then why didn't you?" "Because I was afraid," he admitted, his voice raw. "Afraid that once I started, I wouldn't be able to stop." A tear slipped from my eye and ran down my cheek. "Then maybe," I whispered, "it's time to stop being afraid." His mouth came down on mine, and it was like a dam breaking. All the months of suppressed longing, of silent wanting, poured out in a kiss that was deep and desperate and hungry. It wasn't gentle, it was the kiss of a starving man finally given a feast. I met his hunger with my own, my arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer, erasing the terrible distance that had been between us for so long. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his hands still cradling my face. "I'm still afraid," he admitted. "So am I," said. "But I would rather be afraid with you than be safe and alone." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside that little ranch house, the storm between us had finally broken. The walls hadn't disappeared, but a door had been opened. For the first time, I felt like a wife. Then, he stiffened. "The cattle," he said, the old patterns of duty and avoidance trying to reassert themselves. His hands dropped from my face. "No." I grabbed his hands, holding them tight. "The cattle have weathered storms before. Tonight, we deal with us." Just then, the wind hit the house with a tremendous, shuddering blow. The whole structure groaned. Dust rained down from the rafters. In the distance, we heard a great crash, like a giant tree being torn from the earth. Preston stared toward the door, his jaw tight. He was still torn. "See?" I said, a small smile playing on my lips. "Even Mother Nature agrees. You can't go out in this." To my astonishment, the corner of his mouth twitched upwards. It was the first hint of a smile I had ever seen on his face. "You haven't known me very long if you think weather can stop me." Dead ranchers are notoriously poor at caring for their cattle, I pointed out. This time he actually chuckled, a rusty, unused sound. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. You have a practical way of looking at things, he said. Someone has to. You've cornered the market on stubborn nobility. The teasing felt natural, easy. The honesty between us had unlocked something. He was looking at me now as if seeing me for the first time. I had forgotten, he said quietly. Forgotten what? That talking could be a pleasure, not just a necessity. He shook his head, a look of dawning realization on his face. I've been a coward, disguised as a gentleman. You've been a man carrying a grief too heavy to bear alone, I corrected him. He looked at me, his eyes searching my face. You speak as if you understand. I lost my mother when I was 16, I told him. My father 2 years later. I know what it's like to blame yourself for things you can't control. We moved to the kitchen table and sat down, not in our usual spots, miles apart, but across from each other, close enough to touch. What changed your mind? He asked. Time, I said, and realizing that grief makes us think we have more power than we do. It's easier to blame ourselves than to accept that, sometimes, terrible things just happen. His eyes softened. Sarah used to say something like that. She said I took too much on myself. A tiny, sharp flicker of jealousy pricked at me, followed instantly by shame. This wasn't a rival, this was a ghost. And if he could speak of her without that terrible anguish in his voice, it meant he was beginning to heal. Tell me about her, I said softly. He looked surprised. You want to hear about my first wife? I want to know the man I married, I said. And she is a part of who you are. So he told me. As the storm howled outside, he told me about Sarah. Not about her death, but about her life. He told me about her laugh, which was loud enough to startle horses. He told me about her terrible cooking and her habit of singing hymns off-key. He told me about the time she tried to break a wild Mustang herself and ended up in a mud puddle. What did you do? I asked. I laughed until my sides ached, he said, a real smile spreading across his face. Then I spent 2 hours explaining why some surprises are best discussed beforehand. As he spoke, I saw the man he must have been before grief hollowed him out. A man who could laugh and love and live. Then I told him about my life in St. Louis, about my own losses. We talked for hours, sharing the parts of ourselves we had kept locked away. For the first time since I'd arrived in Kansas, the little house felt like a home. When it was late, he spread his blanket by the fire, but this time, it was with a clear reluctance. Emery, he said as I started up the stairs to the loft, tomorrow, when the storm passes, things will be different. He paused, his gaze intense. I want you to be certain that's what you truly want. Because once I allow myself to be a true husband to you, there's no going back. I won't be able to pretend indifference again. I stopped on the bottom step and looked back at him. I wouldn't want you to. Even with the risks? Especially with the risks, I said. He nodded slowly. Then tomorrow, he said, his voice thick with emotion, we begin again. I climbed the stairs, my heart so full it felt like it might burst. The storm outside was finally starting to weaken. A new day was coming, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what it might bring. The storm had changed everything, but the new beginning wasn't a sudden, passionate explosion. It was more like a slow spring thaw, with the ice between us melting 1 degree at a time. He started staying for a second cup of coffee in the mornings. Our conversations were still mostly about the ranch, but now they were real conversations, not just exchanges of information. The south pasture fence will need to be rebuilt, he said one morning. Would it help if I assisted? I asked, expecting the usual polite refusal. He paused, actually considering it. The work is hard, he said finally, and dangerous. I believe I can handle a few fence posts, I said with a smile. He smiled back. Very well. But you will follow my instructions. Working side by side out on the open prairie, the last of the walls between us crumbled. He was a patient teacher, showing me how to stretch the wire, how to use leverage instead of strength. And as we worked, he talked, not in the careful, measured sentences of before, but in an easy, natural flow. He talked about his plans to expand the herd, about his fears of taking on debt. What would Sarah have counseled? The question slipped out, and I instantly regretted it. But he didn't stiffen. He smiled a little. She would have told me to trust my judgment and stop worrying so much. His expression was soft with memory, not sharp with pain. Sometimes I think her belief in me was stronger than my own. We sat in the shade of a cottonwood, the comfortable silence stretching between us. Emery, he said eventually, his voice serious, are you happy? With this life? With me? The question was so direct, it took my breath away. I looked at his face and saw genuine uncertainty there, a vulnerability I'd never seen before. I am happier now than I was 3 months ago, I said carefully. Then I was lonely and afraid I had made a terrible mistake. He flinched. Let me finish, I said, reaching out to touch his hand. This afternoon, working beside you, talking with you, I have been completely happy. Not just content, genuinely happy. His fingers tightened around mine. I never wished you would disappear, he said, his voice low. I wished I could disappear, so I would stop causing you pain. Then we were both being foolish, I said. I thought your distance was because of my own inadequacy. You could never be inadequate, he said, with a sincerity that made my heart leap. I knew you were brave and kind and generous, and I knew you were beautiful. So beautiful I could barely trust myself in the same room with you. The admission hung in the air between us. You avoided me because you found me attractive. Color rose in his cheeks. I avoided you because I found you irresistible. Every time you smiled, every time you spoke my name, I wanted to forget my vow to Sarah and claim you as my wife in every way. And that terrified me. What changed? I asked softly. You did, he said. During the storm, you forced me to see that my so-called protection was actually a form of cruelty. You stripped away my justifications and showed me the truth. We sat there for a long moment, the prairie wind whispering through the grass. I have a confession too, I said, shifting closer until our shoulders touched. I'm still not completely happy. There are times when I feel incomplete. He went very still. How? We talk, we work together, I said, my voice trembling slightly. But we still sleep apart. We still keep a careful distance. I know you're trying to protect me, Preston, but a life half lived is no life at all. I want to be your wife, in every way that matters. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. I am asking my husband to claim his wife, to stop punishing us both for a tragedy that was not your fault. But if something happens to you, he started, then it will have been my choice to take that risk. I leaned closer. Kiss me, Preston. Not like you did in the storm, full of guilt and fear. Kiss me like a husband who desires his wife and isn't ashamed of it. His hand came up to cup my face, his thumb tracing my cheek. You are certain? He whispered. I have never been more certain of anything. His mouth claimed mine, and this time there was no desperation, only a deep, powerful passion, a promise of a shared future. It was a kiss that sealed a new beginning, a final melting of the ice. When we broke apart, his eyes were burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the sun. We should return to the house, he said, his voice rough. Yes, I agreed. A slow, wicked smile spread across his face. There are arrangements to be made. The promise in his voice sent a shiver of anticipation through me. Then perhaps we should go home, I said, my own smile matching his. It was another hour before we finally started back, and when we walked through the door of the ranch house that evening, we were no longer two strangers living under the same roof. We were husband and wife, and our life together was just beginning. A year later, I stood at that same kitchen window. But now, when I looked out, I didn't see a lonely landscape. I saw my home. I saw Preston, humming as he repaired a fence gate, and when he saw me watching, he looked up and smiled, a real, easy smile that still made my heart skip a beat. The haunted man I had married was gone. The grief was still there. A part of him always would be, but it no longer owned him. He had learned to carry it. "You're watching your husband again," a cheerful voice said from behind me. It was Constance Jenkins, the storekeeper's wife. After the storm, Preston had finally started taking me to town with him, and Constance and I had become fast friends. "Guilty," I said, turning with a smile. "Marriage certainly agrees with you two," she said, accepting a cup of coffee. "I remember when he first brought you to town. You both looked like you were attending a funeral." "We were still learning how to be married," I said. My hand went unconsciously to my stomach, still flat, but holding the most precious secret. "And now," I added softly, "we are learning how to be a family." Constance's eyes widened. "Emery, are you—" I nodded, glancing out the window to make sure Preston was still busy. "It's very early. I haven't told him yet." "How do you think he'll react?" "He will be terrified," I said with a confident smile. "And he will be delighted." "And you?" I thought about it. The ghost of Sarah, the story of her tragic death. It was a part of our story now, but it was not the whole story. "I'm happy," I said. "Nervous, but happy. A life lived in fear of what might happen isn't a life at all." After Constance left, I prepared lunch. The simple domestic task, once a symbol of my loneliness, now felt like an act of love. Preston came in at noon, kissing my cheek as he passed the stove. The easy affection between us still felt like a miracle. We ate, talking about town gossip and ranch business. The silence between us now was comfortable, companionable. Then I took a deep breath. "Preston," I said, "I need to tell you something." He put down his fork, his eyes immediately focused on me, full of concern. "Are you well? You've seemed tired lately." "I am perfectly well," I said, meeting his gaze. "I am with child." The words dropped into the quiet kitchen like a stone into a still pond. He went completely pale. His face was a whirlwind of emotions, joy, shock, and then a deep, familiar terror. He pushed back from the table and went to the window, his back to me. He was silent for a long, long time. I could see the battle raging within him. "Preston," I said gently, "please, tell me what you are thinking." When he finally turned, his eyes were shining with unshed tears. "I am thinking," he said, his voice thick and shaky, "that I am the luckiest man in Kansas, and also the most terrified." I went to him, wrapping my arms around his waist. "The terror is understandable," I whispered, "but why lucky?" He pulled me tight against him. "Because I have been given a chance to be a father, a chance to build a family with a woman I love more than my own life." The breath caught in my throat. In all our growing closeness, he had never said the words. "You love me?" I whispered. He smiled down at me, a soft, wondering smile. "How could I not? You saved me, Emery. You brought me back to life." "I love you too," I said, the words feeling as natural as breathing. "Even though you are going to drive me to distraction with your worrying for the next 9 months." He laughed, a real, full-bodied laugh, and hugged me tighter. "I will try not to be completely impossible." "You will fail," I said, smiling up at him, "but I will love you anyway." We stood there in the bright kitchen, holding each other, the future stretching out before us, full of hope and risk, and a love that was strong enough to face both. 4 summers later, the Kansas heat lay heavy over the land. The ranch house had a new wing and a long shade porch. From that porch, you could hear the sounds of life. A boy, our firstborn, chasing a puppy. A little girl, our Sarah, taking wobbly steps. And a new baby, sleeping in a basket by the door. Preston came up from the corral, dust on his boots and a contented look on his face. Our herd was bigger, our land was prosperous, but our real wealth was the laughter that filled the yard. I met him on the steps with a cup of cold water. "Doc Whitlow stopped by," I said. "He brought that book you asked for." We sat together on the porch bench. It was the doctor's old ledger from his first years in Dodge City. Months ago, after hearing the doc speak about the difficulties of childbirth at a town social, Preston had sent for it. He needed to know. He needed to see the words himself. Now the worn leather book lay open on his knees. He turned a page with a careful, trembling finger. "Here," he said, his voice rough. "Read it." I leaned in. The entry was dated 1878. It named a young mother, Sarah Pittman. The doctor's notes were plain, professional: prolonged labor, 2 days, cephalopelvic disproportion, obstructed birth, hemorrhage, and then the final, crucial lines: husband attentive throughout. No fault of either party, a tragic but unavoidable outcome. I looked up at him. He was staring out at the yard, his jaw set, his eyes wet. "All this time," he said, his voice choked, "I swore I was the cause." "You weren't," I said softly. "The book says it, and I've been saying it for years." He let out a long, shuddering breath. It was the sound of a ghost, a great and terrible weight, finally leaving him for good. A cry came from the basket. I scooped up our newest son and settled him on my shoulder. "Hungry again," I smiled. "Like his father." Preston laughed, the easy sound that was so common now. He kissed the baby's head. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out an old silver watch. He'd had it fixed when our first was born. Today it had a new chain. He snapped it open, listened to its steady, reassuring tick, and pressed it into my hand. "For when I forget the time," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "You remind me." Just then, 2 neighbors rode into the yard. "Afternoon, Preston," one called. "Got some fence line trouble out on Bitter Creek. Figured you were the man to ask." The old Preston, the man who kept to himself, was gone. "Get some coffee," he said over his shoulder to me. "I'll fetch the maps." But before he went inside, he stopped. He put his arm around my shoulders and pulled me close, looking out at our life. Our daughter toddling toward our son, the cattle grazing peacefully, the windmill turning slowly in the breeze. "This is what we made," I whispered. He stood very still, and I felt the last of the tension leave his body. All the years of guilt he had carried like a stone just slid away. "I thought love was a danger," he said, his voice full of wonder. "Turns out it was the shelter." He picked up his hat and walked toward the men, a man who finally, completely, belonged in his own life. "Let's ride," he called to them. "But you're staying for supper. The missus makes a pie that'll set you right with the Lord." They sat on the porch until dusk, talking of cattle and rain, while our children chased fireflies in the yard, their little jars winking like stars. He looked at me, then out at the land we had built together, and I saw the look of quiet shock on his face, the look of a man who can't quite believe his own good fortune. He had refused to touch his bride because he believed his touch brought death. But what touched him now, down to his very bones, was the simple, profound truth. Love hadn't been the danger. Love had been what saved them all. If you enjoyed this story of love, loss, and redemption, please hit that subscribe button. You never know what secrets the next story will uncover.